Good morning, I'm in the mood to talk about OK Computer by Radiohead because this has been on my mind for the past week or so. Now, let me address the elephant in the room. I am doing the totally original thing of talking about OK Computer because no one has ever talked about this. Now, if I were to ever do a video essay on music, okay? Because that's not really something that I think I will ever be able to do just because of copyright. But if I was able to do that, I think Radiohead might be a topic that I would want to cover. Probably several topics, actually, just like Pink Floyd and at least one video on Led Zeppelin. But a point I'm getting at is even even if that's something that I would want to do, even Jay Schlatt was unable to actually finish doing a video essay series on OK Computer. Really was because of copyright problems. But anyway, I'm not too concerned about that when it comes to something more casual like this because I'm not putting a full month's of work of effort into a video on OK Computer. Anyway, so if somehow you don't know what OK Computer is, it is the third Radiohead album that is the probably most accurate representation of what their sound is, at least compared to Creep. Because, yeah, their most popular song, Creep, if you're a fan of Radiohead, you're well aware of this. Creep does not really sound like the rest of what Radiohead would be doing for about 90% of their career. And go figure, their first single would be their most successful one and continue to be their most successful one 30 years later. So, yeah, I'm going to probably be making a few comparisons to Creep while talking about this album, because this album very much is, when it was coming out, very much is still trying to get the fuck away from Creep. To the point where it is kind of also well known that Radiohead fucking hates Creep. Especially Tom York. All of this context is to say that OK Computer is a fantastic album, and if you haven't listened to it, you should listen to it. So this album is technically a rock album, but I hesitate to call it a rock album because it doesn't really feel like what the 90s rock album would sound like. What I'm talking about is when I think of anything from, say, Nevermind by Nirvana to Dirt by Alice in Chains, or even what Dave Grohl started doing later on with Foo Fighters with like Color in the Shape. All of that, and as well all the other different flavors of rock that were going on, all sound very different to than what Radiohead was doing with this album. Now, yes, if you talk about The Bins, it definitely is a rock album. I think OK Computer is special because it is a very production-focused album. When you actually start to listen to it a bit closer, especially if you have good headphones, you should definitely do this a few times. Pay attention to the different layers of the songs. Like, as an example, just the opening track, Airbag. One thing I started to really pay attention to is how you have all of these different, like, fragments of sound that are coming together that just work. To me, there's kind of a weird effect going on with the drums where it almost sounds like it's chopped up and looped and all that, where it's just because of how it sounds. I don't know if that's how they actually did the drum part of that, if they just did like some tape editing with that, or if that was just an effect that was on the actual drum track with the mics and everything. But that is just one example of that. Another example then comes in with all the different guitar parts that exist in that song. If you listen closely, you'll recognize that there's like a whole different guitar part in the left channel compared to the right channel. Specifically during the solo, you can hear this where you have the whole solo pretty much being played out in your left ear, but then you have a tremolo version of it playing out in your right ear. And then you have all the sound effects I mentioned before, where you have, I'm just lumping it into this category, but like the opening, there's actually cellos that you can hear in the background. And then by the end of the song, you just have all these different odd little sound effects. I don't know how to describe them. It's kind of like sound effects you would get from maybe a tape machine or from a computer or things like that, where it's almost mechanical, really closer to like digital, which I think ends up tying in beautifully with even just the name of the album. But it's all these little things where they are making a bit of a soundscape in the songs themselves that not only make a very unique sound, but I think ends up becoming like a precursor to really what you get on Kid A and Amnesiac. Now, I'm not going to elaborate that much more on Kid A or Amnesiac in this video because that's not what this video is about. But if it is your first time listening to OK Computer and as well then Kid A and Amnesiac, you're going to notice that the sound just gets thrown out the window with Kid A and then kind of gets thrown out the window a little bit with Amnesiac, even though those two albums were actually recorded at the same time. Yeah, just the sound in general, really, between OK Computer and Kid A, they were just like, what's OK Computer? What's that? No, we're doing something else, again. But anyway, and that was just me, by the way, describing Airbag, because all of what I just said, you definitely see the rock elements. Obviously you have the guitar in there, obviously you have drums, all that. But then you also start to realize that there's a lot more effort going on in production and making a real soundscape with this album that I think is ultimately what makes this album. Truth be told, I didn't actually really care about this album too much when I first listened to it. When I first listened to this album, I basically did it because I had heard about it. I heard that this was like an important album, you should listen to it, all that kind of stuff. So what I did was one night when I was writing some random ass high school English paper, as I had to do many times, what I did was I ended up just queuing up, it was this album, I think it was also Black Holes and Revelations by Muse, and as well the two Miles Davis albums, Kinda Blue and In a Silent Way. And I think there was a fifth album. I just can't remember what it was. But yeah, I have a lot of stories with the first time I listened to an album basically being summarized by, yeah, I listened to it while I was doing work. Now, when I first listened to this album, the only two songs I really kind of liked from the album were Airbag and Electioneering. I didn't really fall in love with this album at the beginning. I kind of just acknowledged it as, okay, I kind of get what the sound of Radiohead is, and these two songs I like, but that's about it. Because what I think also was a little odd at the time is this was still kind of early in me really exploring music. It had been a couple years since I started doing that, but I think that this was still early enough along where I was kind of used to just finding an album that I immediately fell in love with. As an example, In Rock by Deep Purple, or also Machine Head by Deep Purple. Both of those albums, I think every song on those albums is fantastic. Especially with Machine Head. I think that that is about as close to a 10 out of 10 album without just being better than The Wall for me. That's pretty much what I was still discovering around this time. Another example, The Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails. That was an album that I immediately fell in love with. So, because I was still discovering, like, that kind of stuff, it hadn't gotten as difficult to, like, I don't know, finding an album and then it's like, okay, it's just like a 7 out of 10 album. This, I think, was what that originally kind of was for me at the beginning, but then it definitely grew on me. I think it definitely grew on me because honestly, I think I just started to appreciate the songs a lot more and the compositions, especially Paranoid Android, the second track on here, because there were little things about this that I think finally started to hit me and actually, like, made me go, oh, okay, I get that now, I like that. And it just didn't happen on that one night that I first listened to the album. Yeah, anyway, with Paranoid Android, because I do want to talk about Paranoid Android because I think this is actually my favorite song on the album. I am pretty sure of that. It is right up there as well, like having to compete with No Surprises. Go figure, the like two most listened to songs on the album. But they are two of the most listened to songs on the album for a good reason. With Paranoid Android though, this is a really cool song. Because of it being broken up in multiple parts, it ends up taking on the feel of something like Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a very frequent comparison, where this is almost like Radiohead's Bohemian Rhapsody. And yeah, I think that's an accurate comparison, but I also want to throw in Stairway to Heaven, and even Yes's Close to the Edge, where both of those songs, especially with Close to the Edge, end up telling a story that develops with the song itself, with the actual music, where it slowly starts to build and build to a climax and then a release. And I think that is what ends up making a lot of these like classic rock songs, is when you have a story that is longer than just 2 verses and 2 choruses. And when you then have a lot of nuance to the actual sound of the song, where you end up with enough different parts where it feels like the song does just progress away from where the starting point is. It doesn't just keep going in a circle. In fact, one thing I want to bring attention to with Paranoid Android is actually a early version of it, because this is something that I wish that they somehow could have kept in the final version. The final version is really good, but there is a little thing that I am just a sucker for, and what I'm talking about is the extended jam at the end of Paranoid Android. If you only know the album version of Paranoid Android, you're probably like, what the fuck are you on about? But if you've listened to early live versions of the song, or even some of the like leaked demos, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because what I am talking about is an early version of this song, an early iteration of it, where they actually didn't have the second solo. They pretty much just vamped on the opening chords of the opening. So what was different between the early version and the album version with Paranoid Android is after the line, God loves his children, God loves his children, yeah. Instead of going into like another breakdown in solo, like on the album version, they actually went back to the opening, where they took the opening chords and just started vamping on that, and actually had a little bit of a jam session going on, where you had some solos in there, namely on an organ for one version that I remember hearing. It ends up reminding me a lot more of the song She's So Heavy, or I Want You, by the Beatles, where this song famously goes back and forth between 2 different parts, where you have the opening arpeggio, and then you have the actual verse, and then it goes back to the opening arpeggio, and then the verse, where the song ends by just trailing off into this loop on the opening arpeggio, and then eventually just cuts off. In a way, that's kind of what the early version of Paranoid Android was, and specifically, if you look up the Trident recording of I Want You, She's So Heavy, that actually kind of gives you a good representation of what Paranoid Android was. Yeah, no, that's just a small little nitpick that is just a really like intriguing thing that they used to have that I do kind of wish that they kept in some way. It would have made the song longer, and the song is already the longest song in the album. But yeah, no, that's just a thing that I wanted to point out to bring some attention to, because I think it's pretty cool. And at this point, I think this is where my interest in the album kind of started to fade out, at least back when I was in high school. And even now, like I can kind of see why my brain started to just not really care about the rest of this album, because the album slows down, which you can definitely feel with track 3, Subterranean Homesick Alien. But then it just like goes to a point of being very quiet, and like you can just hear the image of Thom Yorke playing an acoustic guitar in a studio. If you aren't really interested in music that is going to be slower and subdued, then this album may end up actually feeling a little boring. And that was basically where my mind was the first time I listened to this. After multiple re-listens of the album, and then especially when I re-listened to it for this video, so I would kind of know what the hell I'm talking about, I realized that high school me was a fucking idiot. Because I realized, okay, so a lot of the songs on this album kind of follow a very similar way of starting off very subdued and then slowly building until it reaches the crescendo about 2/3 of the way through the song. Now, in fairness, that's a very standard way of making music, but it does become very apparent when you directly look at Exit Music and then compare it to Letdown, Climbing Up the Walls, and then No Surprises, and then Lucky, and then The Tourist. And also, you could probably throw Paranoid Android in there as well. In other words, I just listed off like 2/3 of the songs on this album that end up following this rule. I know I'm probably going to annoy someone by saying this, but I do think that there are a couple of songs on this album that do feel a little repetitive. Okay? Now hear me out. What I'm talking about is if you look at Exit Music, Climbing Up the Walls, and Lucky. They all have a different sonic feel to them. They have a different landscape going on. But it is a little difficult to try and find differences between the songs when Thom Yorke is giving a Thom Yorke performance, and the songs end up starting off subdued and they slowly grow in whatever type of way to make their crescendo. It could be chaos, like with Climbing Up the Walls. It could be, as weird as this is going to sound, but like darkness, like a feeling kind of like that with Exit Music. And also, I'm going to use that same adjective to describe Lucky. There are a lot of similarities between these three songs, and I do remember in high school finding these three songs kind of repetitive. Now, with that said, my opinion has changed on this a little bit, and the reason I do present this opinion is because I think that this is still one of the shortcomings of OK Computer, in my eyes, is that there are moments that do just feel repetitive. To me, when I listen to OK Computer normally, this actually is an album I pick apart, because I don't want to listen to every song on this album, but there are songs on this album that I do definitely want to listen to. And those are Airbag, Paranoid Android, Electioneering, No Surprises, and sometimes Karma Police as well. Now, moving on, or I guess moving back to Exit Music, I did actually grow to like Exit Music over time. There is something going on here with this song, with its production, and I mention this because this ends up happening with a lot of these other songs. There is something towards the end of it that kind of does remind me of Nine Inch Nails. It's specifically all the sound effects. I just can't remember if I'm thinking of the Fragile or the Downward Spiral. I know that I could be describing the Downward Spiral, but I feel like that there is a specific song off of the very long album that is the Fragile that I'm somehow thinking about with the end of Exit Music. Now, with that said, with Exit Music, the whole soundscape thing also carries over into Letdown, especially by the end where you have a mixture of like an arpeggio that sounds kind of like a computer. In fact, I think it might even be a ZX Spectrum, which is the most British thing that you could do on this British album, using a ZX Spectrum 8-bit computer. Also with this song, this is another example of having so many different layered tracks in the production. Just, again, pay attention to how many guitars are actually on this. As for Karma Police, I actually don't really have much to say about Karma Police. I think it's a good song. I didn't really have anything to add about Karma Police. Now, as for Fitter Happier, this is, I think Fitter Happier is an interesting inclusion on this album, because it is the very, like, on-the-nose representation of OK Computer, because you literally have a voice from, like, OS 9, Mac OS 9, I think. You have Microsoft Sam, and then you have Apple's Fred. Apparently that was the name of their, like, voice synthesis thing. This is a interesting song because it's not really a song, it's more of like a poem that is, I was about to describe rap for a minute. No, Fit Your Happier is a poem told by a computer that is then accompanied by an instrumental that ends up fitting very well with this album thematically. Now, with that said, I think that this is such a unique thing that was done. Because this is what Radiohead did, no one else can really do this without it then seeming like, oh, you just copied Radiohead. And I say this as someone that actually tried to do this. Because this was like a long time ago. But I did try to make a song that used a, I forget which preset on Windows it was, but one of the voices on Windows. I tried to make a song using that, and it just didn't come together at all. It was because I was inspired by Fit Your Happier. I was doing that, I think in the back of my head, I just kept thinking, this is just me copying Radiohead, for what reason? And so I eventually didn't do that, but I did look into trying to do it again because of voice synthesis getting better. I thought, oh, maybe I can get a different robotic voice that still sounds better than just
fitter, happier, more productive.
And yeah, no, that ended up falling through as well. Yeah, I feel like that because Radiohead did this, and it's such a unique thing, it is going to be impossible, I think, to, like, take this from Radiohead and like remove its association from just being something that Radiohead did to being something that even another artist did. Yeah, because it is normally this would be a really odd thing to just have on an album, but because it is the cold robotic voice of macOS Fred reading off a poem while you have all this like dissonant noise happening in the background and this general feeling of decay, it ends up working perfectly for the general themes of this album being around the shortfalls of modern society. I will say though that macOS's Fred has so much more emotion to it than the stupid ass TikTok voice. That's all I'm going to say. Now, as for Electioneering, as I mentioned before, this is the second song from this album that I actually liked. And I listened to it a bit closer this time and realized really how raw this song actually is in terms of its production. So everything around this song has been very finely produced. Because I've talked about the soundscapes, I've talked about the different layers and like Airbag, I've talked about the different like stages of Paranoid Android. I've talked about all of this, but then Electioneering, I mean, it feels like an old school rock song from like the 70s. And on top of that, it's just like a brief explosion that lasts for about 4 minutes, about a 15th of the album. And it is also, in terms of just production, very raw sounding. And what I mean by that is listen to the guitar and then compare that tone to every other song on the album. And then also pay attention to the amount of room with the percussion. And what I'm talking about, if you don't know what I'm referring to, is room reverb. Typically, like a clean production, I guess, would be removing any kind of echo, reverb, all that, and just having the like as clean of a signal as possible. That also can be really fucking boring. Typically, you will then sometimes add that reverb back in, such as with a guitar. They sell reverb pedals. Now in this song, somehow how I guess they rigged the drum kit mics, there was just so much room tone that you can hear out of the cowbell and snare that it just ends up fitting with this song. Honestly, and this is a bit of a stretch, but you could compare this song to like Communication Breakdown or Immigrant Song in that like kind of raw feel of just old school rock and roll. And I say this knowing that this album's 25 years old, but yeah, that's generally the point that I'm making, is that this is another song that is breaking a lot of, I guess, the kind of stylistic rules of the rest of this album. Still just fits in. And I think that might have been why this song actually stood out to me when I first listened to the album. Climbing Up the Walls, this last time that I listened to this album, this song actually stood out to me. I don't know why it took this long to realize how good this song is, but the slow buildup of anxiety in this song and its release is mirrored perfectly in the actual production of the song and the instrumentation. Really, what I'm referring to as well is the ending cacophony of noise. It is just wonderful, and this is what I want from Radiohead. A notable future example of this would then be what they do on Kid A with the national anthem. And as for No Surprises, this album really did just say, alright, so are you done being paranoid? You're done? Okay. Here's a nice little lullaby. Oh yeah, this song is also about carbon monoxide poisoning. This album's kind of a little twisted in that respect. Like it's almost like a very dark irony where you end up with this nice and pleasant lullaby type of sound that honestly you could go to sleep with in the best possible way with No Surprises. But then you listen to Thom Yorke a little bit closer and realize this guy is talking about how he's wanting to die to carbon monoxide poisoning. That he's working a job that is just draining his life. You realize how fucking depressing the song actually is. This is one of the rare examples of me looking at the lyrics and be like, oh shit, I might actually like this song more now. Honestly, this is the best song on the B side of this album. The best song on the A side is Paranoid Android. But on the second half of this album, yeah, this is definitely the best song on the second half. And yeah, now for the second to last song, Lucky. Yeah, I originally actually didn't have much to say about this song because it really did kind of just feel like climbing up the walls for me again. But then I looked into it a little bit and realized, okay, so this is actually the genesis point for this album. Because apparently this song was originally made for a charity album that then kind of inspired how the band was going to then make the rest of this album. I almost feel like that in terms of track arrangement, if Lucky showed up earlier, say where Exit music is, I might actually give more of a care for this song than I do in reality. Because it's not a bad song, and that is something I want to emphasize with this album, is none of these songs are bad. And the last song, The Tourist, I think it's a fine ending to the album. I think it also is a very interesting thematic ending, because the opening song is about getting into a car accident, and then this last song is about being someone witnessing a car accident and almost being involved in the car accident because the car hits you. Interesting inclusion, the car accident theme on this album, because then you also, I mean, okay, with Lucky, you also have plane crash inclusion, and if you look at the album cover, this is probably just the most appropriate album cover ever now that you know just 3 of the songs on this album. What is the OK Computer album cover? Oh, it's an interchange. And what's that little thing on the right side? Oh, is that the nose of a plane? I've always found Radiohead's artwork from OK Computer onward to be interesting to look at, especially anything with OK Computer and Kid A and Amnesiac. I think it ends up kind of being an odd album cover with OK Computer because it does kind of feel thrown together like it's just a collage of, I don't know, newspaper articles, magazine cutouts. When you start looking through some of the art for it, but it ends up just working, and I just don't really know why. Maybe it is just because of the album artwork being that iconic that you can just recognize it as, oh, OK Computer, it's Radiohead. While I would like to end the video now, I do have to give a very brief rundown of OK Not OK, because this is a re-release of OK Computer that happened in, I think, 2017. Yeah, because it was to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the album. This was actually out by the time that I checked out OK Computer, so it's very likely that the first version of OK Computer I listened to was a remaster. There is like no fucking difference between the OK Computer from 1997 and the OK Computer from 2017, at least from what I can tell. It's not like we were going to get cleaner tracks or something like that because production was suddenly going to be a lot better. It's not like we were getting a remaster from, like, an album that was made in 1965. Maybe there is something different, but I really couldn't hear anything different about the OK Not OK version. One funny thing I want to point out about OK Not OK is it took me an actual, like, 3 months or something to realize that the name of the re-release was OK Not OK. I'm not joking when I say this, but for those 3 months, I actually thought the name of the re-release was OK No Talk, or Oknok Talk. And then I somehow realized, no, moron, it's OK Not OK. So it had several different releases because you had like a deluxe version and all that. You also had an alternate album cover with this one where there's just like the side of it is burnt up. It's also the side that had the plane on it, so I guess the plane crashed into State Junction. That's kind of an odd thing to have, but sure, that's just what the artwork is. However, this release, what it did was it compiled a lot of material from the OK Computer sessions and what came from it. So obviously the first CD in it is the album, but the first 3 tracks on OK Not OK was previously unreleased material. You then had stuff from the Karma Police single, stuff from Paranoid Android, which I think technically would be an EP, not a single, because apparently it had 5 songs on that single and was 26 minutes. Somehow that's a single. And then, no surprises, that also was a single that had a couple songs on it. What is worth talking about with this, and I'll skim through these a bit, it's actually interesting to listen to this because it obviously gives the full context of the album. It gives you the full story, if you will, because it is also including all this extra, like, literally B-side material from singles and bringing it into one collection. Because these were songs that fit with OK Computer. It is specifically with one of these releases that I feel, one of the unreleased songs, that make the whole thing worth it. Some of these singles kind of feel like that they should have been from the bins. Like Pearly and the second part of Polyethylene. They both sound like songs from the bins, and with Polyethylene Part 2, it either sounds like the song The Bins or Bones. It becomes very clear why these songs didn't make it to the actual album. Specifically, I can see this with Melatonin, I can see this with A Reminder. I can kind of see this a little bit with How I Made My Millions a little bit because of how, like, raw the production on that is. I talked about with Electioneering having very raw production. How I Made My Millions has even rawer production because it sounds like it is a single mic at a piano with Tom York singing while playing. And it's a great song. It actually feels like a predecessor to In Rainbow's Videotape. But these songs generally that already were released with the singles being included, they do paint the picture of, in my opinion, what the transition between the Bins and OK Computer is, which I think is pretty cool. And would I listen to any of these songs again? Probably would listen to How I Made My Millions again. Maybe I'd listen to Pearly again. Maybe. But really, one song off of this day, it listened to a lot, and is what I think makes OK Not OK worth it, is Man of War. This is a song that is very interesting because, to my understanding, actually predates the album entirely and came about in the Benz session. And this version or this song went through a lot of revisions. Man of War was pretty much in production hell from the looks of things, because you can actually hear an early version of it on like some bootlegs, some live bootlegs, where it is pretty much together. There's just little things that are different about it. There's also a clip from the documentary Meeting People is Easy, where the band is trying to record this and they just can't fucking nail it. So it's very clear that this song took a lot of time to try and get right, and then eventually putting it on the back burner. It took even longer to eventually get right, where now it being out, and I mean it's been out for 5 years, but now that it is finished, it's a great song. And the actual explanation for like the motivation behind the song was to make an homage to James Bond themes. And I can kind of hear it with this one. I think that this song ultimately stands on its own, and apparently this song was also supposed to be used for a James Bond filmed in 2015, Spectre. But due to some weird stuff, they couldn't use it for that because it needs to be an original song, so whatever. But I think it was that kind of pushed the song to finally being finished. But I can see why it didn't really make it on OK Computer, because it doesn't really fit. I don't know where I would put it on OK Computer. Maybe if you ditched Fitter Happier, this would be track number 7 on OK Computer. So, yeah, that is OK Computer. I've just been talking about for an hour. My final thoughts. OK Computer embodies exactly what Radiohead is, even the stereotypes of Radiohead, far more accurately than Creep. Most people know Radiohead, I'd say the majority of people know Radiohead for Creep and Creep alone, if you aren't a Radiohead fan. But if you're a Radiohead fan, you probably know about, no, actually you know all the songs on OK Computer. And if you're the next step of a Radiohead fan, then you're then familiar with like any of the other albums. With this album, just looking at it in maybe the least charitable way possible, you have Thom Yorke just sadly moaning about life, plus plenty of instrumentals that feel kind of depressing on the surface. However, no matter what, every track is very well produced. That is just how it is. But then looking at it more charitably than just saying, oh yeah, it's just a depressing album, it's a sad album. Looking at it beyond that, there are so many moments that then break this. Where as I explained with No Surprises, that is a happy song by just the sound of it itself, with some really depressing lyrics behind it. However, a lot of the lyrics on this album, when you start to look at them, kind of are depressing. Especially Climbing Up the Walls. But what sets this apart is that this is like a more mature depressing. So this isn't like your stereotypical being sad because of a breakup type of album. Where the song Creep is about someone who is sad because someone that they are attracted to won't love them back. This album is a step beyond that, where yes, it is a kind of depressing album at many points. What it looks at isn't teenage love or young adult romance, but instead is moved on to something that is a little bit more deep, specifically looking, as I said before, the shortfall of modern existence. In a way, kind of similar to what The Wall was, except not as theatrical. So what I'm saying is, this album is stereotypically Radiohead, in like what you would think Radiohead is, even just by only being exposed to Creep, except it is more mature. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of this album, is how mature Radiohead is with this album compared to Creep. Because Creep was their first single, and Pablo Honey was their first album. This is their third album, and it shows how much they grew in the 90s. Because without this album, you don't end up with all the more experimental stuff you end up with, especially on Amnesiac. Admittedly, as well, even King of Limbs. Now, one thing to keep in mind is I think because of this album choosing to focus on these more mature ideas, along with also having very tight production, along with not sticking to the then current sound, it has made it where this album hasn't aged as poorly as it maybe could have if you just had, say, the Bends 2. Because the Bends, without a doubt, it just sounds like an album that would be from the 90s. OK Computer, it has a little bit to it, where it does feel like it is from the 90s. But there is a bit to it that also still makes it feel pretty new. Now, I wasn't alive in 1997 when the album came out, but I think now, in 2023, where this album still feels pretty fresh to me, it still feels pretty modern, and it kind of still feels prophetic 25 years after its release, kind of like The Wall. This is the most approachable that Radiohead will be moving forward, and yes, that even includes In Rainbows. And that is because this is the starting point of a lot of the more experimental ideas that they would later do on later albums. Yeah, so what album should I talk about next week? Maybe. I don't know how fast it's going to be for me to make these. I don't know, for a little while it might be just me talking about music that I just want to talk about. Anyway, subscribe to the channels. I'm out.